August 1944. World War II is entering its final, most violent chapter as General George S. Patton and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery engage in a race that threatens to shatter the Allied coalition. Before Winston Churchill can celebrate a British victory, Patton's Third Army will commit a strategic heist that changes history. But behind the legendary speed lies a disastrous decision that would eventually haunt George Patton forever. By mid-August 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had become a bloody memory, and the Allied forces were finally surging across the French countryside toward the German border. This was the moment General George S. Patton Jr. had been waiting for, ever since he assumed command of the U.S. Third Army on August 1st. He didn't just want to defeat the Wehrmacht, he wanted to annihilate them with a relentless armored sprint that defied the slow, methodical planning of his British rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. However, the American advance was facing a silent, invisible enemy that no amount of ivory-handled revolvers could stop: the complete exhaustion of Allied fuel supplies. The industrial scale of World War II had transformed gasoline into the red blood of war, a resource as vital as the .50 caliber rounds feeding the machine guns of the M4 Sherman tanks. As the Third Army raced east, it was consuming a staggering 350,000 gallons of fuel every single day. The supply lines, stretching nearly 500 miles back to the Normandy beaches, were at the breaking point. The Red Ball Express, a trucking system composed mainly of African-American drivers, was performing miracles. But the physics of distance were inescapable. For every 5 gallons of fuel loaded onto a truck at the beachhead, 4 were consumed just to deliver the remaining 1 to Patton's spearheads in Lorraine. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHAVE, Eisenhower faced a leadership dilemma that would define the final year of the war. Montgomery was championing a narrow front strategy, a massive 40-division thrust into northern Germany to seize the Ruhr industrial heartland and end the war before Christmas. Patton, supported by General Omar Bradley, argued for a broad front that utilized American speed to keep the enemy in a state of psychological collapse. When Eisenhower ultimately granted logistical priority to Montgomery for Operation Market Garden, Patton found his gasoline allocation slashed to just 1/4 of his daily requirements. To the world, the Third Army was on the defensive. To Patton, this was a declaration of logistical war against his own superiors. Patton refused to let his tanks become iron statues in the mud of France. He turned to his G2, Colonel Oscar Koch, the man he called the best damned intelligence officer in any United States Army command. Koch's analysts were meticulously tracking declassified National Archive reports and ultra-intercepts, the top-secret British decryption of German Enigma traffic. They weren't just looking for German panzer divisions. They were hunting for Wehrmacht Class 3 depots. Koch's daily unit war diaries from late August 1944 reveal a clandestine mission to identify German fuel dumps left behind during the retreat toward the West Wall. What followed was a logistical insurgency within the Allied ranks. Under the direction of Patton's G4, Colonel Walter J. Muller, Third Army Ordnance units began a campaign of midnight requisitioning. Foraging parties from the 4th Armored Division would paint mud over their unit designations and pull into 1st Army fuel depots, claiming to be part of Bradley's command. They siphoned hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline meant for other American divisions. But even this was not enough to sustain the pace Patton demanded. He looked across the lines to the enemy's own supplies to bridge the gap. The key to this heist was the German Einheits-Kanister, the legendary Jerry Can. Superior in every way to the leak-prone Allied 5-gallon Blitz cans, the Jerry Can was a masterpiece of engineering that Patton's men seized by the tens of thousands. In the salt mines and warehouses of eastern France, Third Army mechanics worked under lantern light, rethreading German spark plugs to fit American engines, and mixing captured Wehrmacht synthetic fuel with whatever Allied gasoline they could scavenge. This wasn't just a tactical improvisation. It was a total disregard for the official supply chains that Eisenhower was trying to manage. Despite the stolen fuel and the seized German assets, the Third Army finally hit a wall of steel at the Moselle River in mid-September. The gasoline shortage had allowed the Germans time to rush reinforcements, including the 11th Panzer Division from as far away as Italy. Out of a morning mist at Luneville, factory-fresh Panther tanks emerged with their high-velocity guns, mauling the thin screen of American armored cars. Patton was furious, writing in his diary that stopping his advance was the momentous error of the war. He believed that if he had been given the gas, he could have been in Germany within 2 days. When ordered to adopt a posture of aggressive defense, while Montgomery's market garden operation unfolded in the north, Patton interpreted the order with characteristic audacity. He told his staff that the Third Army would carry out armored reconnaissance toward the Rhine. In reality, he was using every drop of captured German gasoline to push his lines forward, seizing the historic heights of Verdun and the champagne warehouses of Reims. He was getting so involved that Schaeff could not stop him. Patton's success was not merely a result of his ego, but of a unique military culture he fostered within the Third Army. Unlike the top-down hierarchical structure of Montgomery's 21st Army Group, Patton encouraged a leadership flow that favored rapid adaptation. He welcomed frontline GIs into his war room to identify performance gaps in real time. By the winter of 1944, the Third Army had become a self-correcting machine, fueled by a mixture of American guts and stolen German resources. As March 1945 approached, the Western Allies stood on the west bank of the Rhine, the final natural barrier protecting the German heartland. To the north, Montgomery was preparing a spectacle: Operation Plunder. It was to be a meticulously planned three-army assault involving 1 million men and a 5,000-gun artillery barrage. Montgomery had even invited Prime Minister Winston Churchill to witness the crossing, promising him a crowning moment that would seal the British Empire's place in the post-war order. The meticulous planner versus the armored cavalier. Montgomery's airfield at Venlo was a hive of activity, with press photographers capturing every moment of his walk with Churchill. The Field Marshal had accounted for every variable, every bullet, and every bridge section. But 200 kilometers to the south at the town of Oppenheim, Patton was looking at the dark, metallic blue water of the Rhine with very different ideas. He didn't have 1 million men or a wall of fire. He had the 5th Infantry Division and a secret stash of Navy LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, that his staff had been quietly stockpiling since the previous autumn. At 2200 hours on March 22, 1945, while Montgomery was still checking his inventory for the next day's assault, the 11th Infantry Regiment of Patton's 12th Corps slipped into the water at Oppenheim. There was no preceding artillery barrage. There were no paratroopers. The American soldiers, their faces blackened with cork, rode in absolute silence. They were counting on the fact that the Germans expected an attack north of Mainz. Patton had feinted at the city and struck south, catching the defenders completely by surprise. The silence was suddenly shattered by a single German flare that illuminated the river, casting long, terrifying shadows against the opposite bank. A machine gun stuttered in the distance, and water geysers erupted around the Higgins boats. But the momentum of the leadership flow was unstoppable. By daylight on March 23rd, Patton had put 6 battalions on the east bank of the Rhine for a loss of only 28 men. He had jumped the river a full 24 hours before Montgomery's meticulously planned operation could even begin. Patton stood on the newly completed pontoon bridge at Oppenheim, looking north toward Montgomery's sector. He was grinning like a man who had just stolen the most important prize in the world. He immediately called General Bradley on a field telephone. "Brad!" Patton shouted over the noise of rumbling tanks. "Don't tell anyone, but I'm across. And Brad, tell Monty I urinated in the river as I went over." It was the ultimate jab at British military doctrine, achieved through a combination of tactical audacity and the logistical heist of the century. While Patton's tanks were already fanning out into the German interior, General Omar Bradley was preparing a jab of his own. At a crowded press briefing in the 12th Army Group headquarters, Bradley announced the Oppenheim crossing with a measured, weary satisfaction that masked his delight in upstaging the British. "American troops can cross the Rhine anywhere," Bradley told the stunned journalists, "without aerial bombardment or airborne troops. We don't need a 3-week buildup to jump a river." The leadership flow of the American command had effectively captured the headlines, leaving the British set piece to look archaic and unnecessary. On March 24th, Montgomery's massive barrage finally began. Winston Churchill, puffing on a cigar, watched the crossing from the grassy banks. A scene that felt like a relic of the 19th century. The Prime Minister even had a picnic lunch with Montgomery and Field Marshal Alan Brooke, complete with a white tablecloth and a bottle of wine. As German shells hit the river, sending up great jets of water, Churchill remained unperturbed. He eventually crossed into enemy territory himself, narrowly avoiding shell fire near the railway bridge at Wesel. It was an adventurous expedition that General Eisenhower later criticized as far too daring. But for Churchill, it was about the narrative of victory, a narrative that Patton was rapidly rewriting. Patton didn't wait for the applause of the London press. His Third Army was already engaged in a massive sweep of the Saar-Palatinate, an operation codenamed Undertone. His armored columns were racing through German towns at a dizzying speed, bypassing resistance and overrunning German lines of communication. In every town square, white flags hung from windows, and GIS were guarding thousands of German prisoners of war. The Wehrmacht's 7th Army was collapsing, its soldiers low on morale and, most importantly, out of fuel. German General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzerlehr Division recalled that his units were forced to move on foot because there was no gasoline to be spared. On April 4, 1945, the Third Army stumbled upon the Reich's final, most desperate secret. In a salt mine at Merkers, 200 miles southwest of Berlin, the 90th Infantry Division uncovered a cache that defied imagination. Behind a heavy steel door lay 250 tons of gold bullion, billions in foreign currency, and thousands of crates of stolen art from across Europe. It was the wealth of a continent, hidden in the dark to sustain a Nazi national redoubt in the Alps. A single G1, flashlight in hand, walked into the cavernous room, his light glinting off the gold bars. The scale of the plunder was breathtaking, the physical evidence of a civilization that had fed on the destruction of others. When Patton arrived at the mine with Eisenhower and Bradley, his reaction was characteristic. While Eisenhower and Bradley stood in somber silence looking at the wreckage of European culture, Patton turned to his G4, Colonel Muller. "I don't care about the gold, Muller," he reportedly said. "Can I use it to buy gasoline?" Muller's dry reply, that Nazi bullion wasn't accepted at the pump, highlighted the central obsession of the Third Army. Even with the war nearly won, the thirst for fuel remained the driving force of Patton's command. Eisenhower, however, was looking at the political map of the post-war world. Intelligence suggested the Nazis were planning a final stand in the mountains, the mythical National Redoubt. Despite Churchill's pleas to race the Soviets to Berlin, Eisenhower ordered Patton to turn his army sharply south, toward Bavaria and Austria. The race to Berlin was over for the Americans. The political fate of Europe was being decided in those final miles, as a red arrow representing the Soviet army closed in on the German capital from the east. On April 29th, the leadership flow that had fueled the pursuit across France and Germany hit a wall of absolute horror. The Third Army reached Dachau. The GIs who had joked about stolen champagne and urinating in the Rhine now found the true face of the enemy. The shock and grief were etched into the features of the American soldiers as they opened the gates to find the skeletal survivors of the Holocaust. The glory of the race had evaporated, replaced by a grim understanding of why the war had to be fought to the bitter end. But Patton was still Patton, and his impulsiveness would lead to one of the most controversial decisions of his career. In a desperate attempt to rescue his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, from a POW camp at Hammelburg, Patton sent a small task force 50 miles behind enemy lines. Task Force Baum was a disaster. Out of 314 men, only 35 returned to Allied lines. 57 vehicles were lost. It was an absurdly dangerous mission that even Patton's most loyal officers, like Creighton Abrams, had questioned. The greatest general was prone to the same waste of war he so often lamented. Despite the setback at Hammelburg, the Third Army pushed into Czechoslovakia and Austria. By May 8, 1945, they had taken 1.4 million prisoners and liberated over 12,000 cities and towns. They had outpaced Montgomery, outfought the remnants of the Wehrmacht, and redefined modern mechanized warfare. As a column of Third Army tanks sat beneath the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, the war in Europe officially came to an end. In occupied Germany, Patton stood in his open-top Cadillac, reviewing a parade of his veteran troops. He was in full-dress uniform, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the sun. To his men, he gave a final defiant speech. "You are the finest soldiers the world has ever seen. You have moved faster and fought harder than any army in history, and you did it on stolen gas and American guts." It was a moment of supreme triumph for a man who believed he was destined for greatness. But the gasoline war had a tragic epilogue. In December 1945, on his way to a pheasant hunt with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, Patton looked out at the derelict, burned-out cars along a rainy German road near Speyer. "How awful war is," he remarked. "Think of the waste." Moments later, his Cadillac collided with a 2.5-ton truck. The man who had survived the panzers of the Ardennes and the shells of the Rhine was mortally injured in a low-speed accident. The success of the Third Army was not just a matter of tanks and fuel. It was a victory of a specific military culture, one that embraced change, urgency, and the systematic exploitation of information. The information advantage generated by Patton's staff, from Colonel Koch's ultra-intercepts to Colonel Muller's logistical improvisation, provided the blueprint for the modern American military. The gold of Merkers was transferred to American vaults in Frankfurt, and the seized German assets were inventoried as the Allies began the long process of reconstruction and denazification. The war booty that Patton had used to fuel his tanks became the foundation of a new post-war order. Historians still debate the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery, the clash of egos that often threatened Allied unity. But as the sun rose over the bridge at Oppenheim in March 1945, the reality was clear. Montgomery had his meticulously planned Operation Plunder, but Patton had the Rhine. He had crossed it first, his way, with stolen fuel and an unyielding will to win. George S. Patton Jr. was a man who outpaced history. He was a commander who understood that in the chaos of industrial warfare, the only way to survive is to go forward, regardless of the cost, regardless of the orders, and regardless of whose gasoline you have to steal to get there. In your opinion, was Patton's disregard for official supply lines a necessary tactical brilliance or a dangerous risk that undermined Allied unity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.